Darnell Foster had always found solace in his art. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, his surroundings were often harsh and unforgiving, but art was his escape. The world outside his small apartment was one of struggle, but within the confines of his modest, cluttered studio, Darnell could create and breathe. His work, raw and deeply personal, reflected his experiences growing up Black in a system that often marginalized people like him. His paintings told stories of race, identity, and the lives of those living in the shadows of society. From a young age, Darnell had used art as a coping mechanism. With limited resources, he found creative ways to express himself. Painting became his outlet for the confusion and frustration he felt living in a world that saw him as less than. His work explored the complexities of his identity, the layers of history that shaped him, and the resilience of his community. He painted about the strength of Black women, the struggles of being Black in America, and the generational pain that came with systemic inequality. It was a form of protest, a call for recognition. But despite his incredible dedication and talent, the mainstream art world had ignored him. Galleries, auction houses, and critics dismissed his work as too raw, too unrefined, and far too personal. Darnell had shown his art to a handful of gallery owners, hoping for exposure, but each rejection stung, and each closed door pushed him further into isolation. Still, he never gave up on his dream of one day being recognized for the stories his paintings told. Even though the art world seemed uninterested, Darnell continued to paint, pouring his heart into every brushstroke, hoping one day the world would see the value of his work. Introduction to Jonathan Caldwell, the gallery owner. Jonathan Caldwell was the owner of Caldwell Gallery, one of the most prestigious and well-respected galleries in the art world. He had built his reputation by showcasing established artists with impeccable credentials, those who came from prestigious art schools, those who had already proven themselves in the art market, and those whose work could be sold for large sums to wealthy collectors. Jonathan's gallery catered to high-end art buyers and elite collectors, making it a symbol of status and exclusivity in the art world. Jonathan's view of art was shaped by a traditional and elitist perspective. He believed that art was something to be admired, but it also had to conform to certain aesthetic standards that excluded works that didn't fit into the conventional mold. For Jonathan, the most important thing was the reputation of the artist and the pedigree they brought with them. He didn't care about an artist's background, the struggles they had endured, or the stories they were trying to tell. What mattered was whether the artist had been trained in the right institutions, had the right connections, and could appeal to his wealthy clientele. This narrow view of art made Jonathan a gatekeeper in the industry, and over the years, he had become more rigid in his selection process. He rejected artists whose work didn't fit the established norm, artists who didn't speak the language of the elite or fit within the walls of high society. To Jonathan, art was a commodity, something to be bought, sold, and admired by the wealthy, not a tool for social change or a reflection of personal struggle. First encounter, Darnell approaches the gallery. With dreams of one day seeing his work showcased in a renowned gallery, Darnell made the decision to approach Caldwell Gallery. He knew the risks, but the opportunity was too important to pass up. He carefully selected his best pieces, works that spoke to the themes of identity, race, and the struggle for equality, and put together a portfolio that he felt captured the essence of his artistic journey. Armed with his portfolio and a quiet hope, Darnell entered Caldwell Gallery for the first time. The gallery's sleek, pristine space intimidated him. The walls were adorned with high-priced, polished works, many of which were from artists who had already established their names in the art world. He felt like an outsider in this world, a world he longed to be a part of but had never been welcomed into. Still, he held his head high as he approached Jonathan Caldwell, who was standing in front of a large abstract piece, eyes scanning the canvas. "Mr. Caldwell," Darnell began, his voice a mix of nervousness and determination. "I'm an artist, and I've been working on some pieces that I believe would fit your gallery. I'd like to show you my work." Jonathan turned, sizing Darnell up with a glance. He took the portfolio from Darnell's hands without much enthusiasm, flipping through it quickly. His eyes scanned the pieces with a dismissive air, barely lingering on any one of them for more than a few seconds. The silence in the room grew heavy as Jonathan finished flipping through the last of the pages. "This is interesting," Jonathan said, his tone cold. "But it's too raw, too unpolished. I don't think this kind of work is suited for a gallery like ours. We represent artists with more, shall we say, refined techniques. Well, it's just not what we're looking for." Darnell's heart sank. He had poured everything into these paintings, and Jonathan's rejection felt like a direct blow to his passion, his identity, and his worth. But Jonathan's words were not just a critique of his art, they were a dismissal of Darnell himself. His background, his identity, and his experiences didn't fit into Jonathan's narrow view of what art should be. "Thank you for your time," Darnell said, trying to keep his voice steady. He turned and walked toward the door, the sting of rejection heavy on his shoulders. As the door closed behind him, Darnell felt a mixture of humiliation and determination. He had been dismissed, yes, but he wouldn't let it stop him. Jonathan Caldwell might have closed the door, but Darnell Foster was determined to open his own. "I'll show them," Darnell thought to himself as he stepped into the street. He didn't need Caldwell Gallery to validate his art. His journey had only just begun, and he would prove that his work, his truth, was worth something. While Jonathan Caldwell remained stubborn in his traditional views, dismissing Darnell Foster as an unknown and unworthy of recognition, the artist's work began to take root in other, more progressive circles of the art world. Darnell's art, filled with raw emotion and deeply tied to his own experiences as a black man navigating systemic oppression, began to speak to those who were ready to listen. As Darnell's work explored themes of black identity, resilience, and the complex history of African communities, it found a passionate audience in smaller, underground art spaces. These collectors and curators were drawn not only to the power of Darnell's visual storytelling but to the authenticity and urgency of his work. They understood that his paintings were more than just art, they were powerful commentaries on race, survival, and personal struggle. As word spread, Darnell's work became a voice for the marginalized, offering a reflection of their own experiences and struggles. Niche galleries that championed diverse perspectives began to showcase his work, and his pieces started to command higher prices. Though still excluded from the major galleries, Darnell was now gaining recognition within circles that valued art for its cultural significance over its adherence to traditional aesthetic norms. His work was seen as a vehicle for cultural dialogue, and it gained traction as a force of artistic and social change. Darnell's loyal following of art collectors and enthusiasts continued to grow, and his success in these smaller, independent spaces laid the foundation for the next phase of his career. Each exhibition, each new painting, drew more people to his work. His paintings were not only representations of his personal journey but a broader commentary on the Black experience, and this resonated deeply with the audiences who understood that struggle. Breakthrough moment, Darnell's auction success. Darnell's breakthrough came unexpectedly when one of his most powerful pieces, The Unseen Story, was bought by a prestigious auction house. The painting, which captured themes of African heritage, the resilience of Black communities, and the erasure of their stories in mainstream history, was one of his most emotionally charged pieces to date. It was bold, visually striking, and full of the complexities that defined his work. When the painting went to auction, the response was overwhelming. The bidding escalated far beyond anyone's expectations, and The Unseen Story sold for an eye-watering sum, far more than Darnell had ever dreamed possible for a work of his. The sale not only validated Darnell's skill as an artist but also solidified his status as a cultural force in the art world. The auction success immediately brought him into the limelight, and the once dismissed artist was now an artist to watch. This success propelled Darnell into a new level of recognition. Major collectors began to take notice of his work, understanding the value not just in financial terms but in the depth of meaning behind each brushstroke. Critics praised his ability to merge modern abstraction with rich cultural narratives, calling his art groundbreaking and vital for the current moment. Darnell was no longer an artist in the margins, he was now a major player in the art world. Despite his newfound success, Darnell remained humble and focused on his craft. He was driven not by the financial rewards or the praise he was now receiving, but by a deeper desire to continue telling stories that needed to be heard. The pressure of success did not overwhelm him, instead, it fueled his determination to stay true to the purpose behind his work. The art world had begun to recognize him, but Darnell understood that his journey was about more than just accolades. It was about creating art that challenged the status quo and reshaped the cultural narrative. Gallery owners continued dismissal. While Darnell's star was rising, Jonathan Caldwell remained oblivious to the growing demand for his work. The gallery owner, still entrenched in his narrow, elitist view of art, refused to acknowledge Darnell's success. To Jonathan, the buzz around Darnell was nothing more than a passing trend. He continued to dismiss Darnell's art as overhyped, considering it too raw and unrefined to be a lasting force in the art world. Jonathan's adherence to his traditional ideas prevented him from seeing the changing landscape of art, where new voices and new perspectives were beginning to take center stage. As Darnell's career skyrocketed, Jonathan's gallery began to flounder. The major buyers and collectors who once flocked to Caldwell Gallery were now looking elsewhere, seeking work that felt more relevant, more in tune with the cultural conversations of the moment. While Jonathan stuck to the artists he had always represented, artists who fit the mold of sophistication and status, Darnell was becoming a symbol of a new era in art. The art world was shifting, and Jonathan was stuck in the past. Darnell, of course, was unaware of the full extent of Jonathan's frustration until one day, as he was walking through a gallery in the same building, he overheard a conversation between Jonathan and a fellow gallery owner. Jonathan's voice was filled with disdain. "You know, Darnell Foster's work is just a fad," Jonathan was saying. "His pieces are too raw, too political. The market will tire of it soon enough." The words stung, but Darnell didn't let them faze him. Instead, they served as a catalyst for his resolve. Jonathan had dismissed him once, and now, even as Darnell's work was commanding millions at auction, Jonathan was still clinging to his outdated, elitist views. Darnell's quiet success had turned into a resounding testament to his talent, and the dismissals from Jonathan only fueled his determination to continue on his path. He wasn't seeking validation from someone who couldn't see the true value in his art, he was building something much larger. The conversation he overheard was a reminder of the old guard's refusal to adapt, and it solidified Darnell's belief that his success was about more than just proving someone wrong. It was about reshaping the art world entirely, opening doors for artists who didn't fit into the rigid structures Jonathan and others like him had built. Darnell knew that his journey wasn't just about fame or financial success, it was about something deeper, something that would transform the art world and leave a lasting impact. And with every new opportunity, every piece of art he created, Darnell was steadily proving that his work was here to stay. Darnell Foster's meteoric rise in the art world was undeniable. Once dismissed by the gatekeepers of the art establishment, his paintings were now some of the most sought-after works in contemporary art. The very pieces that had once been rejected for being too raw were now exhibited in prestigious international galleries and commanding prices in the millions at high-profile auctions. His work was no longer just a personal expression, it had evolved into a symbol of cultural pride, resistance, and the untold stories of marginalized communities. Darnell's paintings, celebrated for their emotional depth, cultural relevance, and innovative blending of contemporary techniques with traditional African influences, spoke to more than just his experiences. His art had become a mirror reflecting the struggles and triumphs of an entire people, resonating with a global audience that recognized the power of his storytelling. Critics praised his ability to merge abstraction with narrative, using his canvas as a vehicle for social change. His pieces were not only visually captivating, they were transformative, challenging the way people saw race, identity, and history. As his fame continued to grow, so did his influence. Darnell became one of the most in-demand artists of his generation, attracting global collectors who saw his work not just as a financial investment but as a cultural landmark. Major museums began requesting his work for exhibitions, cementing his status as one of the most important artists of his time. His influence was felt beyond the art world, as his paintings sparked important conversations about race, identity, and the role of art in social justice. Darnell had moved from a rejected outsider to a tastemaker, shaping the future of contemporary art and solidifying his place in history. Jonathan Caldwell's realization. Back at Caldwell Gallery, Jonathan Caldwell was beginning to feel the weight of his earlier dismissal of Darnell. As the buzz surrounding Darnell's work grew louder, Jonathan couldn't ignore the success that was unfolding before him. He saw the astronomical prices that Darnell's paintings were fetching at auction and realized that he had let a rare opportunity slip through his fingers. His gallery was no longer the center of attention. Younger, more innovative artists like Darnell were taking the lead, attracting the very collectors who once supported his gallery. Jonathan's gallery, once the epitome of high-end art, began to struggle. The market had shifted, and his traditional approach to art no longer seemed relevant in a world that was embracing new voices and diverse perspectives. As Darnell's career soared, Jonathan watched helplessly as other galleries signed exclusive deals with the artist, capitalizing on his success while his own business faltered. The frustration and regret began to set in. Jonathan realized that, by dismissing Darnell, he had missed an opportunity that could have changed the course of his business. Jonathan's failure to recognize the potential in Darnell's work was becoming more and more glaring. He had always prided himself on his ability to spot talent, but in this case, he had failed miserably. As Darnell's success outpaced his own, Jonathan could only watch as the art world moved on without him. He knew he couldn't keep clinging to the past, but he was unsure how to move forward without the young artist who had so profoundly disrupted the industry. Darnell's new identity. With his newfound wealth and influence, Darnell took full control of his career. He was no longer reliant on traditional galleries or middlemen to showcase his work. He began negotiating directly with curators, museums, and galleries, cutting out the gatekeepers who had once stood in his way. Darnell understood the power he now held, not just as an artist, but as a leader in the art world. He didn't need the validation of people like Jonathan Caldwell to prove his worth. His work spoke for itself. But Darnell's success was about more than just personal gain. He was committed to using his platform to empower others. Drawing on his own experiences as a marginalized artist, Darnell started mentorship programs for emerging artists, particularly those from underrepresented communities. He wanted to ensure that other artists wouldn't have to face the same rejection and exclusion that he had. Through his programs, Darnell provided financial support, exhibition opportunities, and invaluable guidance to artists who had been ignored by the mainstream art world. Darnell's rise had never been just about wealth or fame. It was about reshaping the art world, creating a space for diverse voices to thrive, and ensuring that art remained a platform for self-expression, change, and cultural dialogue. He knew that the art world had the power to change hearts and minds, and he was determined to use his influence to make that happen. His success was not just a personal achievement, it was a victory for all the artists who had been told they weren't good enough, for all the voices that had been silenced for too long. As his career continued to flourish, Darnell became a role model for future generations of artists. He had proven that anyone, regardless of their background or identity, could succeed in the art world if they were given the opportunity. Darnell's legacy was built not just on the works he created but on the doors he had opened for others, creating a new paradigm in the art world where inclusion and diversity were not just valued, but essential. Darnell Foster had reached the pinnacle of his success, but his journey was far from over. While the art world now recognized his name and his work, Darnell understood that true power lay not just in the art he created but in the institutions that shaped the industry. He had proven himself as an artist, but he now saw an opportunity to reshape the very structures that had once rejected him. Caldwell Gallery, the institution that had once turned him away, now represented the old guard of the art world, an institution stuck in its narrow, elitist vision of art. Using the financial independence he had gained from the auction successes of his paintings and the backing of investors and collectors who believed in his vision, Darnell devised a strategic plan. He would buy shares in Caldwell Gallery, not just as an artist, but as a businessman. By becoming a significant shareholder in the gallery, Darnell could influence its direction, bringing the same cultural relevance and diversity that had defined his work to the very space that had once dismissed him. Darnell quietly began purchasing shares in the gallery, using his network of supporters who shared his values. As Jonathan Caldwell's gallery continued to struggle financially, Darnell's influence began to grow. His increasing stake in the gallery was met with little resistance at first, as Caldwell Gallery's management remained oblivious to Darnell's silent takeover. But Darnell knew that the time was coming when he could reshape the gallery into a hub for new, emerging voices, artists whose work reflected the modern, diverse, and inclusive art world he was building. Darnell's plan was not just to take control but to transform the gallery into a space that would prioritize the very values he held dear: creativity, cultural relevance, and inclusivity. He began to introduce new policies that focused on showcasing diverse artists, particularly those from marginalized communities. The gallery would no longer represent only the established names, it would become a platform for emerging talent that had long been ignored. In doing so, Darnell would not only reshape the gallery but also the art world at large, positioning Caldwell Gallery as a cultural leader for the future. Jonathan Caldwell's downfall. As Darnell's influence over Caldwell Gallery grew, Jonathan Caldwell found himself facing the consequences of his failure to adapt to the changing art world. His refusal to embrace new voices, new forms of art, and a more inclusive approach had left his gallery floundering. Where once the gallery had been the pinnacle of high society, it was now becoming irrelevant in an industry that was increasingly focused on innovation, diversity, and social relevance. The art world was moving on without Jonathan. Major collectors who had once been drawn to Caldwell Gallery were now flocking to other galleries that showcased artists like Darnell, artists who spoke to the times, who reflected the changing landscape of culture, and who were able to capture the complexities of the world through their art. While Jonathan remained stuck in his traditional approach, Darnell's name continued to rise, and the value of his work reached unprecedented heights. As the art world began to shift, Jonathan's business began to suffer. His gallery's once stellar reputation was tarnished, and the collectors who once came to him now sought out new opportunities to invest in emerging talent. Jonathan's inability to adapt to the changes left him scrambling, watching helplessly as his business slipped through his fingers. Meanwhile, Darnell continued to thrive. His exhibitions were now featured in top museums and galleries around the world. His works had become invaluable, and his influence within the art world grew exponentially. While Jonathan's gallery struggled to stay afloat, Darnell was securing high-profile deals and exhibitions, making a name for himself not only as an artist but as a tastemaker, a visionary, and a leader. The art world had moved on from Jonathan Caldwell, and now it was clear, Darnell was the future. The final confrontation. The moment of reckoning arrived when Darnell, having quietly secured enough shares in Caldwell Gallery to gain control, confronted Jonathan Caldwell. Jonathan had been oblivious to Darnell's silent takeover until now. When Darnell called him to a meeting at the gallery, Jonathan's first instinct was to assume it was just another casual conversation about business matters. But Darnell had other plans. As the two men sat across from each other in the gallery's sleek, modern office, Darnell finally revealed the truth. "Jonathan," Darnell began, his voice calm but firm, "I wanted to meet with you today because I need you to understand something. I now hold a majority stake in Caldwell Gallery. I own it." Jonathan's face turned pale as the weight of Darnell's words sank in. He had known something was changing, but he hadn't realized how far Darnell had gone. "I've watched this gallery struggle for years," Darnell continued. "While you held on to outdated ideas of what art should be, the world around us changed. The art world is evolving, and it's time for this gallery to reflect that. This gallery will now be a place for artists who speak to the world we live in today, not just to the elites of yesterday. It will be a space for new voices, for diversity, and for cultural dialogue. And I'm going to make that happen." Jonathan, stunned by the turn of events, finally spoke. "But this gallery. I built it. It's mine. You can't just..." Darnell held up his hand, cutting him off. "You may have built it, Jonathan, but your refusal to adapt left it in ruins. You never saw the value in artists like me, artists who don't fit your mold. My success was never about proving you wrong. It was about creating something better. Something bigger. Jonathan's arrogance faltered, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely humbled. "I was wrong about you, Darnell. I admit that. I didn't understand. I should have given you a chance." Darnell's expression softened, but his resolve remained unwavering. "Your apology doesn't change anything. My success was never about gaining your approval. It was about changing the way this industry works. I'm offering you a position within the new gallery structure, but make no mistake, this is my gallery now." Jonathan's pride was wounded, but he knew there was no going back. The gallery he had built had been taken from him, and the future of the institution now lay in Darnell's hands. He could only watch as Darnell's influence eclipsed his own. Darnell stood up, offering his hand to Jonathan. "I'm not here to destroy you, Jonathan. I'm here to change the game. I just hope you'll come along for the ride." As Darnell walked out of the office, Jonathan sat back in his chair, defeated. He had underestimated the power of Darnell Foster, and now he was left to watch as the world he had built crumbled around him. Under Darnell Foster's leadership, Caldwell Gallery underwent a profound transformation. Once a space reserved for the elite, where only a select group of polished artists were showcased, it became a thriving hub for emerging artists from diverse backgrounds. Darnell's vision was clear: the gallery would no longer be a place that upheld traditional standards of exclusivity and elitism. It would be a platform for cultural dialogue, creative freedom, and innovation. The gallery now welcomed art that challenged the status quo, reflecting the complexities of modern society. Darnell implemented policies that made space for underrepresented artists, especially those from marginalized communities, to exhibit their work and gain the recognition they deserved. The gallery became a space for art that spoke directly to the struggles, histories, and triumphs of those often overlooked by the traditional art world. Whether through bold, abstract paintings that addressed social issues, sculptures that explored identity, or multimedia installations that questioned the status quo, Caldwell Gallery became a place where creativity could flow without restriction. In addition to transforming the gallery's exhibitions, Darnell focused on the future of art by creating mentorship programs for young artists, particularly those from underprivileged backgrounds. These programs provided the next generation of creators with opportunities that had once been denied to him: financial support, gallery exhibitions, and exposure to a network of influential curators and collectors. Darnell made it his mission to ensure that young artists would not have to face the same barriers that had once kept him on the margins. These programs provided the tools and resources that could help elevate new voices and ensure their work reached a global audience. As the years passed, Caldwell Gallery became a beacon for cultural transformation within the art world. It was no longer just an exclusive gallery, it had become an influential force that shaped conversations about art, culture, and social change. Darnell's work had done more than just bring his art into the spotlight, it had redefined what art could be, ensuring that it would always be a space for self-expression, change, and diversity. Reflection on the journey. Looking around the gallery one evening, as a new generation of artists prepared for their exhibitions, Darnell Foster reflected on how far he had come. He remembered the days when his work had been dismissed as too raw or unrefined, when he had been told that his voice wasn't worthy of the same platform as more traditional, established artists. He remembered the humiliating rejection by Jonathan Caldwell and the difficult years he spent trying to break through in an art world that had little interest in his truth. But now, he stood as the owner of one of the most respected galleries in the world, having reshaped it into a space for creative freedom, cultural dialogue, and inclusivity. Darnell's journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every struggle. His success was never just about personal achievement, it was about creating a legacy that would empower others. His rise to prominence was built on resilience, vision, and an unwavering belief in the power of art to change the world. Darnell's story had proven that anyone, regardless of their background, could succeed if given the right opportunities. He had fought for a place in an industry that hadn't initially seen him as worthy, but he had pushed through, proving that talent and authenticity could, and should, be valued. He had paved the way for other artists who came from backgrounds like his, ensuring that they wouldn't face the same obstacles he did. Through his own hard work, Darnell had dismantled the gatekeeping structures that once excluded him, creating a space where all artists could thrive, regardless of their pedigree. Darnell's lasting impact. Darnell Foster's legacy was not defined by the millions his paintings had sold for or the accolades he had received. It was defined by the lasting impact he had on the art world. He had shown the world that success was not reserved for the privileged or for those with the right connections. It was for those who dared to believe in themselves, who had the courage to share their unique vision, and who refused to let the traditional barriers hold them back. His mentorship programs had helped launch the careers of countless young artists, many of whom had gone on to achieve their own successes in the art world. Darnell's influence had stretched far beyond Caldwell Gallery. His commitment to breaking down barriers had inspired artists, curators, and collectors across the globe to rethink the art world's narrow definitions of success and value. He had proved that art, at its core, was about expression, truth, and connection, not about wealth, pedigree, or exclusivity. Through his gallery, his mentorship, and his work, Darnell had created a platform for artists to express themselves freely, without fear of rejection or exclusion. He had shown that art had the power to challenge the status quo, to break down the walls of inequality, and to reshape society's understanding of culture, race, and identity. His legacy would live on not only through his own paintings, but through the work of the countless artists he had helped along the way. Darnell's story had proven that the art world, much like society itself, could be transformed when people stood up for what they believed in. His impact had changed the way the world viewed art, and he had made sure that those voices that had been historically ignored were now front and center, celebrated for their power, their truth, and their authenticity. Darnell Foster had not just changed the art world, he had changed the world itself.